An elderly woman steals her black neighbor's holiday decorations out of resentment but gets caught, sparking anger and a journey toward redemption. Write in the comment where you watching this video from. Maple Ridge was the kind of neighborhood you'd see in real estate brochures, where the grass was trimmed with laser precision, the driveways were spotless, and every home seemed to carry an unspoken promise of security. It was a neighborhood of routines and whispers. Neighbors who waved politely from across the street but kept their curtains drawn when things got too interesting. At the end of the cul-de-sac stood the Johnsons' home, a cozy corner lot that radiated warmth and charm. Unlike the pristine symmetry of its neighbors, the Johnsons' yard was alive with seasonal cheer, especially during the holidays. If it was autumn, there would be scarecrows waving from the lawn and pumpkins on the porch. Spring brought pastel blossoms and Easter eggs nestled in the garden. Thanksgiving, however, was their true piece de resistance. This year was no exception. By the second week of November, their yard had transformed into a festival of gratitude. Bales of hay lined the driveway, each topped with cheerful arrangements of chrysanthemums and miniature gourds. A family of hand-painted wooden turkeys stood proudly in the garden bed, their tails fanned out in bright oranges, reds, and yellows. A scarecrow, stitched by Maya Johnson herself, grinned amicably from its perch near the mailbox. Above all of this hung a hand-painted banner stretched across the porch. Gratitude is a choice. It wasn't just decorations. It was a tradition, a labor of love. Maya, a second-grade teacher with an artist's soul, had spent weeks preparing each piece with her 7-year-old daughter, Zoe. Together, they had glued googly eyes on turkeys, painted signs with bold strokes, and carefully arranged the yard into what Zoe proudly called their grateful garden. To most of Maple Ridge, it was charming, if a bit much. But to Eleanor McCafferty, it was an eyesore. From her window across the street, Eleanor sat sipping her tea, the rim of her cup pressed so firmly to her lips that it left a faint red imprint. She had lived in Maple Ridge for 32 years, long enough to see the neighborhood change in ways she didn't particularly care for. Back when she first moved in, she liked to believe everyone shared her sensibilities. Understated, tasteful, respectful of the unspoken rules that kept the neighborhood presentable. Things like inflatable decorations or banners in front yards would have been unthinkable. But in the past decade, things had shifted. Younger families had started moving in, and with them came bolder colors, louder parties, and, most annoyingly, more elaborate holiday displays. Eleanor had learned to tolerate the eccentricities of most of her new neighbors. But the Johnsons, they pushed her limits. They just don't know when to stop, Eleanor muttered, her sharp gray eyes narrowing at the Johnsons' yard. She took another sip of her tea, now lukewarm, and clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "What's bothering you this time, Ellie?" Her husband, George, called from his recliner in the living room. He barely looked up from the crossword puzzle spread across his lap. "It's them again," Eleanor said, nodding toward the window. "Adding more stuff." George, who had grown weary of Eleanor's commentary on the Johnsons, let out a soft groan. "What's wrong with a few decorations? It's Thanksgiving." "It's not just a few, George. It's a production," Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly. "There's a difference between celebrating and showing off." "They're good people," George replied without much conviction. "You should let it go." Eleanor stiffened. "It's not about them being good people. It's about respecting the neighborhood. This isn't some fairground." Deep down, Eleanor wasn't sure why the Johnsons' decorations bothered her so much. It wasn't just the decorations themselves. It was the way they seemed to invite attention. It was the way people seemed to gather around their yard, laughing and smiling, as if it were some kind of community event. Eleanor preferred her neighborhood the way it had always been. Quiet, orderly, predictable. And, though she'd never admit it to anyone, there was another reason the Johnsons unsettled her. Eleanor couldn't help but notice how often their house became the hub of activity in the cul-de-sac. Neighbors dropped by to chat with Darren, who seemed to have a talent for fixing everything from broken sprinklers to faulty internet routers. Kids from the block came over to play with Zoe, who had an infectious giggle that carried across the street. And Maya? She had a way of connecting with people that Eleanor couldn't quite match, no matter how hard she tried. It wasn't that Eleanor disliked them. Not really. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't quite fit. The sound of laughter snapped Eleanor out of her thoughts. Across the street, Zoe was skipping in the yard, holding a bundle of orange paper leaves. Maya knelt beside her, stringing the leaves onto a garland that would soon be draped along the porch rail. Darren emerged from the house, carrying a steaming mug of cocoa for his wife and daughter. He kissed Maya on the forehead and handed the mug to Zoe, who giggled and wrapped her tiny hands around it. Eleanor watched the scene unfold with a tightness in her chest that she couldn't quite name. She turned away from the window and set her teacup down on the counter, harder than she intended. "They're turning the neighborhood into a circus," she muttered under her breath. George didn't respond. He had already gone back to his crossword, content to let Eleanor stew in her own indignation. That night, as Eleanor lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the Johnsons' yard. The banner in particular haunted her. Gratitude is a choice. What kind of choice was that, really? Eleanor thought she had spent her life being grateful for her stable marriage, her quiet home, her predictable routines. But somehow, the banner felt like a challenge, as if it were daring her to examine her life and come up short. She turned over, pulling the blankets tightly around her. The Johnsons didn't belong here, she told herself. And their decorations certainly didn't belong here. Someone needed to do something about it. Eleanor McCafferty stood at her kitchen sink, scrubbing a plate with more force than necessary. Through the window, she had a perfect view of the Johnsons' front yard, a kaleidoscope of decorations that seemed to multiply each time she looked. That morning, they'd added another piece to their already crowded display. A bright red wagon filled with pumpkins, nestled beside a cluster of hay bales. She huffed under her breath, rinsing the plate so aggressively that water splashed onto the counter. The scarecrow still stood tall at the edge of their lawn, its cheerful, painted face tilted at just the right angle to seem as though it was looking directly at her. She turned away from the window and dried her hands on a dish towel, muttering to herself about the absurdity of it all. The neighborhood had never looked like this before the Johnsons moved in. For decades, Maple Ridge had been a picture of modesty. Simple string lights at Christmas, a few pumpkins on porches in October. Nothing ostentatious, nothing loud. The Johnsons didn't seem to understand that kind of restraint. Or maybe they did, Eleanor thought bitterly, but simply didn't care. She could still remember the first time Maya had invited her to one of their backyard barbecues. She had been polite, of course, standing near the grill while Darren expertly flipped burgers and Maya laughed with the guests. But Eleanor had felt out of place, surrounded by people who seemed so comfortable in their liveliness. The Johnsons were too open, too willing to draw attention to themselves. Eleanor wasn't sure if it was confidence or something else, but it made her uncomfortable all the same. As she dried the last plate, she heard Zoe's laughter drifting across the street. Eleanor froze, the sound grating against her nerves. She walked to the window again, leaning slightly to get a better look. There Zoe was, skipping along the walkway with a handful of paper leaves, which she was handing to her mother. Maya crouched on the grass, tying the leaves into a garland that would soon join the others already hanging from their porch. Darren appeared moments later, carrying 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. He handed one to Maya and ruffled Zoe's hair before heading back inside. Eleanor's lips tightened as she watched the little family. It wasn't envy, she told herself. She didn't wish for their liveliness, their energy, their seemingly endless capacity for togetherness. No, it wasn't envy. It was irritation, annoyance. Their yard looked absurd, and she couldn't understand why the rest of the neighborhood seemed to enjoy it so much. The tea kettle whistled behind her, and she turned to the stove, trying to shake off her thoughts. As she poured the hot water over her chamomile tea bag, George wandered into the kitchen, scratching his head and yawning. "Still stewing about the decorations?" he asked, his tone neutral but knowing. He'd grown used to Eleanor's complaints about the Johnsons, though he didn't share her sentiment. "I'm not stewing, George," she snapped. "I'm just concerned. They're turning the neighborhood into a circus." Someone has to say something. George smirked, leaning against the counter. Who's it hurting, Ellie? People like it. Besides, it's just a couple of turkeys and some pumpkins. It's not just the decorations, she said, her voice rising slightly. It's the principle. Maple Ridge used to have standards. Standards? George chuckled. Ellie, it's Thanksgiving. Let people have their fun. She didn't respond. Instead, she stirred her tea, her irritation simmering beneath the surface. Fun. That's all it was to George and apparently to everyone else. But to Eleanor it was something more. The Johnsons' decorations weren't just decorations. They were a challenge to the unspoken rules of the neighborhood. And Eleanor wasn't ready to back down. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streetlights flickered on, Eleanor found herself standing at her living room window once again. The Johnsons' yard glowed faintly under the soft orange porch light, their banner swaying gently in the breeze. Gratitude is a choice. She squinted at the words, reading them over and over as if they held some hidden meaning. Gratitude. Choice. She snorted, turning away from the window and letting the curtain fall back into place. What did the Johnsons know about gratitude? They flaunted their happiness as if it were a trophy, a bright, obnoxious beacon for all to see. Eleanor sat down in her favorite armchair, picking up the latest book club selection from the side table. It was a cozy mystery, the kind she usually enjoyed, but tonight she couldn't focus. The words blurred together on the page, her thoughts circling back to the Johnsons. Her irritation grew heavier, like a weight pressing against her chest. By the time George came into the room, settling into his recliner with a crossword puzzle, Eleanor had made up her mind. I think I'll bring it up at book club tomorrow, she said, not looking up from her book. Bring what up? George asked absent-mindedly, his pencil scratching across the page. The decorations, she said. I'm sure I'm not the only one who thinks they've gone too far. George sighed, setting down his pencil. Ellie, don't stir up trouble. People like the Johnsons. You're going to make yourself the villain. Eleanor bristled at his words. It's not about being a villain, George. It's about standing up for what's right. Someone has to preserve the neighborhood's dignity. Dignity? George muttered under his breath, shaking his head. But Eleanor didn't hear him. Her mind was already working, turning over the words she would use to sway her book club friends to her side. The next day, as the women of Maple Ridge gathered in Mrs. Patel's cozy living room, Eleanor waited patiently for the conversation to drift in her favor. They'd just finished discussing the book, an enjoyable enough mystery, though Eleanor found the ending predictable, and were now sipping tea and nibbling on cookies. I don't mean to sound harsh, Eleanor began, setting down her cup carefully. But do you think there should be limits on holiday decorations? Several heads turned in her direction, curious. Mrs. Patel raised an eyebrow. Limits? What kind of limits? Well, Eleanor continued, choosing her words with care, I just think there's a line between celebrating and being excessive. Some people don't seem to know where that line is. There was a murmur of agreement from one or two women, but before Eleanor could feel validated, Linda Barrett spoke up. You mean the Johnsons, don't you? Eleanor hesitated. I'm not naming names. I just think it's something worth discussing. They're not hurting anyone, Linda said, her tone light but pointed. If anything, it's nice to see someone putting in the effort. Mrs. Patel nodded. I helped Maya with the decorations last week. Do you know she made most of them by hand? Even the turkeys. Eleanor forced a tight smile. How creative of her. The conversation moved on, leaving Eleanor simmering in her seat. It was clear that no one shared her concerns. The Johnsons weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. And that realization only deepened her resolve. If no one else would stand up for Maple Ridge, then it would have to be her. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Eleanor made her decision. Gratitude was a choice, wasn't it? Well, she was choosing something else. She would wait until the neighborhood was asleep, and then she would do what needed to be done. The night was still and silent, the kind of quiet that settles over suburbs after midnight. Eleanor McCafferty stood in her garage, the dim light from a single bulb casting shadows across the walls. She adjusted the gardening gloves on her hands, their rubbery surface sticking slightly to her palms. Her flashlight rested on a nearby shelf, its beam cutting a sharp line through the darkness. The garbage bag she'd brought rustled faintly as she smoothed it out. Eleanor told herself this wasn't wrong. It was necessary. It wasn't theft, not really. It was an intervention, a way to restore the neighborhood's dignity. The Johnsons would never know it was her. They'd probably assume it was kids playing a prank. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 1:12 a.m. George was snoring softly upstairs, oblivious to her plan. She took a deep breath, grabbed the flashlight and the bag, and stepped outside. The November air bit at her cheeks as she crossed the street, her steps careful but quick. The Johnsons' yard loomed ahead, its cheerful decorations glowing faintly under the light of the porch lamp. Eleanor paused at the edge of their driveway, her heart pounding. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the lawn. Her first target was the Scarecrow. It stood near the mailbox, its floppy hat casting a shadow over its painted smile. Eleanor couldn't explain why, but the Scarecrow's grin irritated her the most. Felt like it was mocking her, daring her to go through with her plan. She grabbed it by the shoulders and gave a hard tug. The stakes holding it in place creaked in protest, but after a few more pulls, they came loose. Eleanor stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance. The Scarecrow fell to the ground in a heap, its hat slipping off to reveal the wooden frame beneath. "Creepy thing," she muttered under her breath, shoving it into the garbage bag. The stakes poked awkwardly through the plastic, but she ignored them. She didn't have time to worry about neatness. Next, she turned to the turkeys. They were wooden cutouts, carefully painted in vibrant colors. Eleanor crouched down, working quickly to untie the twine that secured them to the fence posts. Her fingers fumbled slightly in the cold, but she managed to free them one by one, stuffing them into the bag with the Scarecrow. As she worked, a faint rustling sound reached her ears. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned the flashlight off and crouched low, her eyes scanning the yard. A gust of wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves, but nothing else moved. After a moment, Eleanor let out a slow breath and stood. She turned the flashlight back on, the beam shaking slightly as her hands trembled. The banner was the final piece. It hung across the porch, its cheerful message a glaring reminder of everything Eleanor resented. Gratitude is a choice. She read the words again as she approached, her teeth clenching. It felt like the banner was taunting her, reminding her of some unspoken failure she couldn't quite name. She grabbed the edge and pulled. The nails holding it in place popped free, one by one, until the fabric came loose. She stuffed it into the bag, barely able to zip it shut. Eleanor stood in the yard for a moment, surveying her work. The decorations were gone, leaving the Johnsons' lawn empty and unremarkable. She felt a strange sense of satisfaction as she turned and hurried back across the street. Her breath fogged in the cold air, and her heart raced, but she felt lighter somehow, as if she'd done something to restore order. Back in the garage, Eleanor stashed the garbage bag behind a stack of old paint cans, covering it with a dusty tarp. She peeled off her gloves and tossed them into a bin, then crept upstairs. George was still snoring, his crossword puzzle lying forgotten on the nightstand. Eleanor slid into bed beside him, pulling the covers up to her chin. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Her mind buzzed with the night's events, and though she told herself it had been the right thing to do, a tiny voice in the back of her mind whispered otherwise. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of voices outside. She went to the window, her heart pounding as she peeked through the curtains. Across the street, the Johnsons stood on their front lawn, their faces a mix of confusion and disappointment. Darren was talking to Maya, his arms crossed, while Zoe clung to her mother's leg, looking up at her with wide, questioning eyes. Eleanor's chest tightened at the sight of the little girl, her expression full of worry. "What do you mean they're gone?" Maya's voice carried across the street, her tone incredulous. "I don't know," Darren replied. running a hand through his hair. Maybe it was kids? A prank or something? Why would anyone do this? Maya said, her voice cracking slightly. She knelt down beside Zoe, brushing a curl out of the little girl's face. It's okay, sweetheart. We'll figure it out. But where's Mr. Scarecrow? Zoe asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, baby, Maya said softly. Maybe he's gone on an adventure. Across the street, Eleanor's stomach churned. She closed the curtains and stepped away from the window, her hands shaking. She told herself the Johnsons would be fine. It was just decorations. They could replace them, or maybe this would teach them to tone things down. But the image of Zoe's tearful face lingered in Eleanor's mind. A sharp pang of guilt she couldn't quite ignore. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Eleanor went about her usual routines, but she couldn't stop thinking about the Johnsons. She saw Darren talking to one of the neighbors, gesturing toward their yard. Later, Maya and Zoe were in the garage, sorting through boxes that Eleanor guessed held their remaining decorations. Eleanor stayed inside, avoiding her window, but she couldn't escape the uneasy feeling that followed her everywhere she went. By evening, the street was quiet again. The Johnsons' yard was bare, their usual glow replaced by a dim porch light. Eleanor sat in her living room, staring at the spot where the Scarecrow had stood. For the first time, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. By the following morning, the buzz in the neighborhood had reached a fever pitch. News of the theft spread quickly, whispered across hedges and muttered over morning coffee. The Johnsons' bare yard stood out like a wound in the otherwise cheerful cul-de-sac, a stark reminder that someone among them had crossed a line. Maya Johnson refused to let it ruin her day, though the sting of it lingered. She walked through her yard, holding Zoe's hand as they surveyed the empty spaces where their decorations once stood. She didn't want to show her frustration in front of her daughter, but it was hard to mask the hurt. The decorations had been more than just ornaments. They were part of a family tradition and an integral piece of her plan for the Thanksgiving food drive she organized every year. Why would someone take our things, Mommy? Zoe asked, her voice small. Maya knelt beside her, tucking a curl behind Zoe's ear. Sometimes people do things that don't make sense, baby. Maybe they were having a bad day and made a bad choice. Zoe frowned. But we worked so hard on them. Mr. Scarecrow, too. We did, and you know what? We can always make more, Maya said, summoning a smile. You can help me, just like before. Across the street, Eleanor watched through her window, her face pale and tense. She told herself she was only curious, but deep down, she knew the real reason she couldn't stop watching. She had seen the way Zoe's face crumpled as Maya tried to console her. The sight of the little girl's distress had unsettled her in a way she hadn't anticipated. Eleanor stepped back from the window, shaking her head as if to clear it. She'd done what was necessary, hadn't she? The Johnsons had no right to turn their yard into a spectacle. But even as she tried to justify her actions, the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. Later that day, as Eleanor clipped roses in her backyard, she overheard Mrs. Patel chatting with another neighbor, Linda Barrett. Their voices carried over the fence, too loud to ignore. Did you hear about what happened to the Johnsons? Linda asked, her tone a mix of disbelief and outrage. Of course. It's awful, Mrs. Patel replied. Who would do something like that? Someone with way too much time on their hands, Linda said, her voice dripping with disdain. And probably no sense of decency. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she snipped another rose, the clippers slicing through the stem with a harsh snap. She couldn't tell if they knew or if they were just speculating, but their words hit her harder than she expected. I hope they find out who did it, Mrs. Patel continued. The Johnsons are such a kind family. They don't deserve this. Eleanor hurried back inside, leaving the pile of rose clippings forgotten on the ground. Her heart thudded in her chest as she closed the door behind her. She told herself the neighbors didn't suspect her. Why would they? No one had seen her that night. No one could possibly know it was her. That evening, Darren Johnson stood in his driveway, talking to his neighbor, Mr. Patel. The two men leaned against Darren's car, their conversation low but serious. Eleanor watched from her upstairs window, unable to resist the urge to spy. "I don't think it was kids," Darren said, his voice carrying just enough for Eleanor to catch the words. "They took everything, even the banner." "That's not a prank. That's deliberate." Mr. Patel nodded. "Have you thought about putting up cameras? It might deter something like this from happening again." "We will now," Darren replied. "But what bothers me the most is what they took. Those decorations weren't just for us. They were part of the food drive." Eleanor's stomach dropped. She leaned closer to the window, her pulse quickening. She hadn't known about the food drive. The decorations had always seemed like a personal indulgence, not a community effort. "The food drive?" Mr. Patel asked. "Maya uses the decorations to bring attention to it," Darren explained. "People see the yard, stop to talk, and then she tells them about the fundraiser. We collect food and donations for local families who need help over the holidays. Last year, we filled 3 truckloads." Eleanor stepped back from the window, her hands trembling. The weight of Darren's words hit her like a punch to the chest. She'd thought the decorations were frivolous, a nuisance, but they had been so much more than that. They had been a way to help others, a way to bring people together. And now, because of her, they were gone. For the next few days, Eleanor found it impossible to shake her guilt. Everywhere she went, she heard whispers about the theft. The Johnsons, however, refused to let it dampen their spirits. Maya began crafting new decorations with Zoe, and Darren started reaching out to neighbors to spread the word about the food drive. Despite everything, their determination remained unshaken. Eleanor, on the other hand, felt as though she were falling apart. She avoided the Johnsons' house entirely, taking the long way around the block when walking Oliver. She ignored the phone when it rang, convinced that every call was someone accusing her of the theft. Even George began to notice her unease. "Ellie, you've been acting strange lately," he said one evening as they sat in the living room. "Is something bothering you?" "No," Eleanor replied quickly, too quickly. She busied herself with a crossword puzzle, but the words swam before her eyes. George raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? You've been jumpy all week." "I'm fine," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. George gave her a long, searching look before shaking his head and returning to his newspaper. That night, as Eleanor lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She had stolen more than just decorations. She had taken away a family's joy and disrupted their efforts to help others. And for what? To prove a point no one else even agreed with? For the first time, Eleanor wondered if there was a way to make things right. But the thought terrified her. Admitting what she had done would mean exposing herself to the judgment of the entire neighborhood. She couldn't imagine facing that kind of humiliation. And yet, as the hours stretched on and sleep eluded her, Eleanor realized she couldn't live with the guilt much longer. Something had to change. Eleanor had spent the past 3 days in a state of near paralysis, avoiding the windows and any neighbor who might catch her eye. She even skipped her usual morning walk with Oliver, fearing she might run into Maya or Darren. The garbage bag in her garage weighed heavier on her mind than she ever thought possible, hidden beneath the dusty tarp, yet impossible to ignore. But the neighborhood wouldn't let her forget. On the 4th day, as she was weeding the flower beds in her backyard, she heard voices approaching. Maya's was unmistakable, gentle but firm, as she spoke with Mrs. Patel on the other side of the fence. "It's not about the decorations," Maya was saying. "It's about the families we help every year. That's what hurts the most." Mrs. Patel murmured something Eleanor couldn't make out, but Maya continued. "Darren's been telling people anyway, but it's harder without the display. The decorations always drew people in, got them talking. Without them, it's harder to spread the word." Eleanor sank lower behind the hydrangeas, her hands trembling around the trowel. The weight of her actions seemed to grow heavier with every word. She had stolen more than decorations. She had disrupted something far bigger than her petty grudge, a community effort to help those in need. She crouched there long after the voices faded, her chest tight with the kind of shame she couldn't rationalize away. That evening, Eleanor ventured into her garage for the first time since the theft. She stood over the garbage bag, staring at the bulging sides where the stakes of the scarecrow poked through the plastic. Her hands hovered over the tarp as if uncovering the bag would force her to confront the full enormity of what she'd done. Finally, with a sharp intake of breath, she pulled the tarp back and dragged the bag into the center of the garage. The flashlight she'd used that night was still lying nearby. Its cold, metallic gleam seemed to accuse her. Eleanor dropped to her knees and opened the bag. The banner was on top, its cheerful, looping letters mocking her in the dim light. Gratitude is a choice. She ran her fingers over the fabric, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to shed. For the first time, she let herself feel the full weight of her guilt. She had stolen joy and kindness and left behind a void she couldn't fill. She had to fix it, but she didn't know how. When George found her in the garage hours later, she was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by the Johnsons' decorations. He stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "Ellie," he said quietly, "what's all this?" She looked up at him, her face pale and drawn. Her voice cracked, and she couldn't finish the sentence. She looked down at the scarecrow in her lap, its floppy hat crumpled between her fingers. George's eyes widened in realization. "Ellie, you didn't. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said, her voice trembling. "I just wanted them to stop. I didn't know about the food drive, about what it meant." George sat down heavily on a nearby stool, running a hand through his thinning hair. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then he sighed, the sound heavy with disappointment. "You have to make this right." Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She knew he was right, but the thought of confessing filled her with dread. She imagined the looks on her neighbors' faces, the way they would whisper about her at block parties and avoid her at book club. She imagined Zoe's tearful eyes, filled with hurt and confusion. The shame was almost too much to bear. The next morning, Eleanor didn't walk across the street. Instead, she watched as Maya set up a makeshift display on their front porch with the decorations they'd managed to salvage. It was smaller than the original, but still cheerful. Eleanor could see Zoe handing Maya a bundle of paper leaves, her smile tentative but hopeful. The sight only deepened Eleanor's resolve. She couldn't live with this secret any longer. That afternoon, she walked across the street carrying the garbage bag. The weight of it made her arms ache, but she didn't stop. When she reached the Johnsons' porch, Maya opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw Eleanor standing there. "Mrs. McCafferty," Maya said, her voice cautious. "What can I do for you?" Eleanor swallowed hard, clutching the handles of the bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. I have something to return," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She set the bag down on the porch and stepped back. Maya's brow furrowed as she looked down at the bag, then back at Eleanor. "What is this?" "It's your decorations," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. I took them. I thought they were too much. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. I didn't know about the food drive. I didn't know how much they meant to you and your family. I'm so sorry." For a moment, Maya didn't respond. She looked at Eleanor, her expression unreadable, then down at the bag. Finally, she crouched down and opened it, pulling out the banner. She held it up, running her fingers over the fabric, and let out a soft sigh. Eleanor felt the silence stretch between them, unbearable in its weight. "I'll understand if you don't forgive me," she said quietly. I needed you to know the truth." Maya stood, the banner still in her hands. She looked at Eleanor, her expression softening. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Eleanor admitted, "but it was the least I could do." Maya nodded, then stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "Let's talk." Eleanor blinked in surprise, then nodded and stepped inside. The house was warm and smelled faintly of cinnamon, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in her chest over the past week. As she sat down in the Johnsons' living room, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, something that felt like relief. She wasn't sure what the neighborhood would think when they found out what she'd done, but in that moment, it didn't matter. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt like she could breathe. Eleanor sat stiffly in the Johnsons' living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wasn't used to being in their home, and the warmth of the space felt almost too inviting, as if she didn't deserve to be there. The walls were adorned with family photos. Maya in her graduation cap, Darren laughing at a summer barbecue, and Zoe, her grin bright enough to light up the entire room. Eleanor's gaze lingered on the photos, her stomach knotting with guilt. These were the people she had wronged, kind, generous, and undeserving of the harm she'd caused. Maya returned from the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of tea. She set one down in front of Eleanor and took a seat on the opposite couch, the banner still folded neatly in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her hands, but it did nothing to ease the chill in her chest. "Why did you do it?" Maya's voice was calm but edged with curiosity, a quiet plea for understanding. Eleanor hesitated, searching for the right words. I thought it was too much. The decorations, they felt out of place. I wanted things to be simpler, quieter, like they used to be." Maya's brow furrowed. "Like they used to be?" Eleanor shifted uncomfortably. "Before things started changing. The neighborhood isn't the same as it was when I moved here. I thought, maybe if I could just stop one thing from changing, it would feel more like home again." Maya's gaze softened, but there was sadness in her eyes. "Mrs. McCafferty, we're not trying to change the neighborhood. We're just trying to be part of it. The decorations are our way of celebrating, of giving back. They're not meant to upset anyone." "I know that now," Eleanor said quietly. "But at the time, I couldn't see it. I was so caught up in how things used to be that I didn't think about what they meant to you. And to the community." Maya leaned back, her fingers tracing the edge of the banner. "Did you know the decorations were part of our food drive?" Eleanor nodded, her throat tightening. "I didn't at first. I thought they were just for show. But then I heard Darren talking to Mr. Patel, and I realized what I'd done. That's why I had to return them." Maya studied Eleanor for a moment, then sighed. "I appreciate that you came forward. It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Eleanor admitted, "but it was the right thing to do, and I want to do more than just apologize. I want to help." Maya blinked, clearly taken aback. "Help? With the food drive?" Eleanor said quickly. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but if there's anything I can do, anything at all, I want to make it right." Maya considered this, her expression thoughtful. Then she smiled faintly. "All right," she said. "We could always use an extra set of hands." Eleanor felt a small spark of relief. "Thank you. I'll do whatever you need." The next morning, Eleanor found herself standing in the Johnsons' garage, surrounded by boxes of canned goods, dried pasta, and bags of rice. Maya had explained the logistics of the food drive. Donations came from neighbors, local businesses, and the church down the street. Everything was sorted, packed into boxes, and delivered to families in need. It was a well-oiled operation, and Eleanor marveled at how seamlessly the Johnsons ran it. Zoe was there too, carefully placing cans into a box labeled soups and stews. She glanced up at Eleanor with a mix of curiosity and wariness, as if trying to make sense of her sudden presence. Eleanor gave her a tentative smile, which Zoe eventually returned. As the morning wore on, Eleanor found herself drawn into the rhythm of the work. She sorted donations, taped up boxes, and loaded them into Darren's truck. The other volunteers greeted her politely, though she could feel their curiosity lingering in the air. No one asked why she was there, but Eleanor sensed they knew. The weight of their unspoken questions pressed against her, but she pushed through it, determined to prove she was there for the right reasons. By the end of the day, the truck was packed to capacity, and Eleanor was exhausted but oddly fulfilled. She stood beside Maya in the driveway, watching Darren secure the last box with a bungee cord. "You did good work today," Maya said. Eleanor glanced at her, surprised. "Thank you. It felt good to be part of something." Maya nodded. "That's why we do it. It's not just about helping others. It's about coming together as a community." Eleanor looked down at her hands, still dusty from the day's work. I wish I'd understood that sooner. It's never too late to change, Maya said, her voice gentle. And it's never too late to be part of the neighborhood. Over the next week, Eleanor threw herself into the food drive with a zeal that surprised even her. She handed out flyers, recruited new volunteers, and even convinced a local bakery to donate fresh bread. Slowly, she began to feel a shift, not just in how the neighbors saw her, but in how she saw herself. The rigid walls she had built around her life began to soften, and for the first time in years, she felt truly connected to the people around her. On Thanksgiving morning, the Johnsons' yard was alive with activity. Volunteers bustled about, loading the final boxes into trucks and chatting over cups of hot cider. The decorations, now restored to their rightful place, glowed warmly in the crisp autumn air. Eleanor stood near the scarecrow she had once loathed, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Zoe ran up to her, holding a small, hand-painted turkey. "Mrs. McCafferty, this is for you," she said, her grin as bright as the sun. Eleanor took the turkey, her throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you, Zoe. It's beautiful." Zoe beamed. "Mommy says you're part of the team now." Eleanor knelt down, looking into the little girl's eyes. "I hope I can be." As the trucks pulled away, carrying boxes of food to families across the community, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude. Gratitude for the chance to make amends, for the people who had welcomed her despite her mistakes, and for the lesson she had learned, that belonging wasn't about keeping things the same. It was about embracing the people around you, flaws and all, and finding joy in the ways they made life brighter. Winter had fully arrived in Maple Ridge. Frost glazed the rooftops in the mornings, and every breath in the chilly air formed tiny clouds. The neighborhood hummed with its usual pre-holiday excitement, cars pulling into driveways laden with shopping bags, the smell of fireplaces wafting through the crisp air, and homes glowing with festive lights. For Eleanor McCafferty, this season felt different. It wasn't the decorations or the weather. It was something inside her. She had spent the past month reevaluating not just her place in the neighborhood, but who she had been in it. For years, she had tried to control what Maple Ridge looked like, thinking it would keep her comfortable. But the Johnsons had taught her something unexpected. Belonging wasn't about control. It was about connection. Standing in her front yard, Eleanor meticulously adjusted the small holiday wreath hanging on her door. It was simple as always, but this year, she had added a small turkey ornament, a gift from Zoe. It hung front and center, a burst of color against the green and red. She had resisted the urge to explain it away to passersby. For once, she let herself embrace it as a symbol of change. The Johnsons' house across the street was alive with activity. Their yard had transformed into a delightful blend of Thanksgiving and Christmas cheer. The scarecrow, now wearing a Santa hat, stood proudly among new decorations. Glowing candy canes, handmade snowflakes dangling from tree branches, and an inflatable reindeer in the corner. But the most prominent piece was the banner stretched across the porch, its words as bold as ever. "Gratitude is a choice." Eleanor lingered for a moment, staring at the banner. The words had once made her bristle with annoyance, but now they resonated deeply. Gratitude was indeed a choice. She'd made it over the past few weeks, and it had transformed her life in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of someone calling her name. She turned to see Maya walking across the street, holding a covered plate in her hands. Maya's smile was warm, her steps light despite the chill in the air. "Good morning, Eleanor," Maya said, handing her the plate. "Zoe wanted me to bring you some of her cookies. She made them last night." Eleanor's lips twitched into a smile, something that had started to come more naturally these days. She accepted the plate, the warmth of it seeping into her fingers. "Thank you. Please tell her they'll be gone before noon." Maya laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Zoe would love to hear that. She's already asking about when you're coming over to decorate gingerbread houses. She has this idea that you're some kind of frosting expert." Eleanor chuckled softly. "Expert is a bit generous, but I'll be there. Just let me know the time. Maya tilted her head, studying Eleanor for a moment. I'm glad you've joined us, Eleanor. It means a lot. Not just to us, but to the whole neighborhood. The words struck a chord in Eleanor's chest. She nodded, unsure of what to say, and watched as Maya headed back across the street, her red scarf trailing behind her in the wind. That weekend, Eleanor walked across the street to the Johnsons' house, carrying a tin of peppermint bark she'd made herself. It was the first time she'd been inside their home since she had confessed to taking the decorations, and the warmth that greeted her was almost overwhelming. The living room was a flurry of activity. Zoe was kneeling at the coffee table, carefully arranging gumdrops on a gingerbread house, while Darren stood by the kitchen counter, pouring cups of steaming hot cocoa. "Mrs. McCafferty," Zoe cried, leaping to her feet when she saw her. She ran over, her curls bouncing, and grabbed Eleanor's hand. "Come see what I made." Eleanor allowed herself to be led to the coffee table, where a small gingerbread house stood, already leaning precariously under the weight of candy canes and gumdrops. "It's beautiful, Zoe," Eleanor said, genuinely impressed. "Can you help me make another one?" Zoe asked, her eyes wide with hope. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Of course, but you'll have to show me what to do. It's been a long time since I made one of these." Zoe's face lit up, and she dragged Eleanor over to the kitchen, chattering excitedly about frosting techniques and candy decorations. Maya handed Eleanor an apron, laughing as Zoe launched into a detailed explanation of how to create the perfect gingerbread chimney. Over the course of the afternoon, Eleanor found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. She laughed as Darren accidentally broke a gingerbread roof, cheered Zoe on as she added the final touches to her candy masterpiece, and listened as the neighbors shared stories about past holidays. For the first time in decades, she felt like she was part of something larger than herself. When the last gumdrop was placed, and the gingerbread houses were lined up on the counter, Eleanor stood back and surveyed the scene. The room was filled with laughter, warmth, and a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. She realized then that this was what she'd been missing. Not the orderly, quiet perfection she had tried to cling to, but the joy that came from being part of a community. As the evening wound down, and the neighbors began to trickle out, Eleanor found herself lingering. Maya noticed and approached her, holding 2 mugs of cocoa. "You did good work today," Maya said, handing her a mug. Eleanor smiled, looking around the room. "I can see why you love this so much. It's wonderful." Maya nodded. "It's what the holidays are all about, bringing people together." Eleanor took a sip of her cocoa, letting the warmth settle in her chest. "I've spent so much time trying to keep things the way they used to be. I didn't realize I was missing out on so much." Maya placed a hand on her arm, her touch light but reassuring. "You're here now. That's what matters." When Eleanor left the Johnsons' house that night, the snow had started to fall, dusting the neighborhood in a layer of white. She paused on the sidewalk, looking back at their yard. The decorations twinkled in the glow of the streetlights, the banner swaying gently in the breeze. Gratitude is a choice. For the first time, Eleanor truly understood those words. Gratitude wasn't just about saying thank you. It was about embracing the people around you, letting go of the need for control and finding joy in the unexpected. As she walked back to her house, the snow crunching beneath her boots, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. From that day forward, Eleanor became a cornerstone of the neighborhood. She helped organize events, volunteered at the food drive, and even began adding small, colorful touches to her holiday decorations. Each year, as the Johnsons put up their banner, Eleanor would smile and remember the lesson that had changed her life. Gratitude truly was a choice, and she was finally choosing it.